called creationnorthwest.net, and he'll, I'm sure, mention that here. And also, he's the founder of creationwiki.org, and he's got a lot of stuff on his websites. He also started a apologetics symposium back in 2014 at his church, and he still does that every Wednesday, most Wednesday evenings, except for the summers. And normally I would mention those as well, but he's off for the summer. This group is off for the summer. But this evening he's going to speak on a topic is the Bible and ancient history. Some people think that the Bible history sounds like just a myth, because they look at the Egyptian history and say that timeline looks to be different. The Bible must be wrong. And there are other genealogies too that he is going to, I'm sure, reference in his talk. But when you look at it and study it, you'll see that they do agree with each other. And that's what Chris is going to talk about. Chris, let's welcome him.
So one of our important apologetics is biblical archaeology, and so we're going to take a little kind of overview of Old Testament archaeology today, staying away from some of the topics that Heinz was alluding to. This is a part one, so there is a part two to this where I go into the Egyptian synchrony issue, synchronizing the Egyptian history with the biblical history. Suffice it to say that the Bible is a history book. I mean, you can define the Bible variously, but it is a history book. It describes God's interaction with the world over several thousand years, but it is, it does contain some rich and interesting historical accounts that span over a good 4,000 years. And so tonight, what we're going to be looking at are several aspects of biblical archaeology. Again, in part two, if we have a chance next year or something, we can go into the Egyptian synchrony issue. For tonight, we're going to look at textual authenticity. How do we know that the Bible is true and accurate the way we have it today? How do we know that it's the same as it was when it was originally written? We'll spend some significant amount of time evaluating the two proposed sites for Sodom and Gomorrah. One of the oldest events we could point to, arguably archaeologically. And then we're gonna look at Tel Dan, an important discovery that was made at Tel Dan, and we'll talk about the Hittites as well here in just a second. Our goal in this lecture, these series of lectures in general, is to defend this important historical record, which is today under attack by critics and archaeologists who have claimed that the biblical account of history is inaccurate or in many cases just outright fictitious. Well-known events such as and people such as Joseph or the Exodus from Egypt or the conquest of Jericho have been challenged on archaeological grounds. In fact, the existence of entire empires described in great detail in the Bible have been challenged by secular archaeologists and historians, including the Hittites. Hittites played a prominent role in Old Testament history. Their mentions range from Genesis to the post-exilic Ezra-Nehemiah period. They interacted with biblical figures as early as Abraham and as late as Solomon. According to Genesis 10, the Hittites are the descendants of Noah's great-grandson, Heth, Canaan's son Heth. They are mentioned in Genesis 15 as one of the clans who inhabited the land of Canaan, one of the nations that had to be dispossessed from the land by the Israelites. Abraham purchased a cave from the Hittites to bury Sarah, his wife. He was later buried there, as well as Isaac and Jacob. The Hittites are also mentioned numerous times in reference to the promised land following the Exodus from Egypt. Their presence in the Bible is that of a formidable and powerful empire in the Middle East for hundreds of years. In 1 Kings 10:29, it records that the Hittites purchased chariots from King Solomon. Now, arguably, the most prominent Hittite mentioned in the Bible is Uriah, the husband of Bathsheba. However, prior to the late 19th century, nothing, and I mean nothing, was known of the Hittites outside of the Bible. And many critics alleged that they were an invention of the biblical authors. Archibald Sayce, as shown here, was the first person to point to the historical existence of the biblical Hittites. He held a chair as the professor of Assyriology at the University of Oxford and deciphered inscriptions carved on rocks in Turkey that he stated might belong to an as of yet unidentified pre-Greek culture that he argued were the biblical Hittites. He identified the ruins of Boghaskoy with the Hittite capital city of Hattusa and announced that the Hittites were far from being a small Canaanite tribe, but instead were the people of a lost Hittite empire, which Egyptian texts were only then bringing to light. Hugo Winkler, shown here, conducted excavation at Hattusa and uncovered a portion of the fortified citadel, including 5 temples, several ornate gates, like the Sphinx gate that you see here, or the Lion's gate that you see here. The quantity and sophistication of the artifacts discovered and attributed to the Hittites shows that the Bible was not in error. They were indeed a powerful force with elaborate underground defense systems that have been discovered. And a number of peace treaties have been discovered from the Hittites. In fact, thousands of clay tablets were discovered by Winkler in a storeroom at Hattusa. The tablet on the left contains a treaty establishing Hittite domination over the city of Aleppo in Syria. The tablet on the right is a peace treaty between the Hittite king and Ramses II. The Hittite Empire, like others, made treaties with civilizations they conquered. 24 of these treaties have been discovered up until now, which provide a better understanding of the treaties that are taking place in the Old Testament. Well, today it is now widely recognized that the Hittites comprised an empire that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the banks of the Euphrates. They were a powerful force in the Middle East from 750 BC to 1200 BC, just as the Bible states. They were a massive and long-lasting empire that modern archaeology had completely failed to identify. The discovery of the Hittite Empire has not only verified the accuracy and reliability of the Bible, of biblical history, but has also significantly advanced our understanding of the patriarchal period. Well, it is my hope that through this introduction to Old Testament archaeology that you'll be encouraged to trust in the Bible as authoritative on early earth history, rather than on the claims and teachings of man. In 1 Peter 3:15, we're instructed to always be ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you. Christians need to study apologetics as we, quote, love the Lord with our mind, as we're told in Matthew 22:37, and prepare ourselves for service to him. While some today may consider the Old Testament unimportant for a New Testament church such as ours, we must keep in mind that the Bible is a single book spanning thousands of years, a single book full of history. And if we allow any portion, any of the history within this Bible to be challenged by critics and we don't answer those challenges, it can cause a person's view of the accuracy of the Bible to diminish. Those attacks on events in the Old Testament, if left unanswered, will ripple all the way through to the New Testament, causing a person to doubt the salvation message in the New Testament as well. This is summarized by the words of Jesus when responding to the Jews about his authority and witness. He said, if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. But since you do not believe what he wrote, how are you going to believe what I say? Or similarly, in his response to Nicodemus, Jesus says, I have spoken to you of earthly things, and you do not believe. How then will you believe I speak of heavenly things? If we cannot trust what the Bible says on historical matters, how can we trust what it says on spiritual matters like salvation? Well, our defense of the biblical history would be incomplete without first looking at the case for textual authenticity. Liberal scholars have challenged the accuracy and reliability of the Bible, asserting that errors must have crept in over the centuries and centuries that it was copied by hand by scribes. The question is, and should be answered, how can we be sure that the text we have today is accurate? How can we be sure that the text we have today is still accurate? Well, this challenge was difficult to answer until recently. Now, the text shown here is was the oldest Hebrew manuscript of the Bible in existence, and it was written in the 10th century A.D., this text you have here, thousands of years after some of the historical events had transpired. This is the Masoretic text, part of what is called the Aleppo Codex, which is almost universally regarded as the canon for the Jewish Bible, what's called the Tanakh, the Hebrew name for the Old Testament, and was the basis for the translation of the Old Testament in the Protestant Bible. The question is, how can we be sure this text was accurate, the Masoretic text? Well, the critical challenges to biblical authenticity was substantially answered by the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found, as the name implies, near the Dead Sea in Israel between 1947 and 1956. They were discovered in a series of caves in the region of the Dead Sea known as Qumran, identified for you there, which lies about 13 miles east of Jerusalem, and are therefore called the Qumran Cave Scrolls also. The first scrolls were found in 1947 by 3 local Bedouin shepherds who happened upon containment jars in a cave after hearing pottery break. As the story grows, they were throwing rocks to entertain themselves, shooting for a target, a cave mouth, and when the rock shot into the cave mouth, they heard pottery break, an unmistakable sound similar to glass breaking. When you hear glass breaking, you know glass is breaking. They knew pottery was breaking. Well, between 1947 and 1956, after the discovery, a total of 801 scrolls were found. 221 biblical texts, 580 non-biblical scrolls were found. And almost 90% of them were found in this one cave right here called Cave 4 at Qumran that I've identified for you there. You can actually see this cave from the highway. If you take a tour to Israel, which I would strongly encourage you to do, it will impact your faith like nothing else will. Find a tour group and take you a tour to Israel. I would encourage you. But if you know someone that, if you're with a tour bus and a tour group that knows the location of it, they can stop on the side of the road and point out this cave to you. I had to steal this one off of Wikipedia because it was a little more of an elevation, and taking a picture through a bus window doesn't always come out quite so good. Well, among the 221 biblical manuscripts that were discovered was the famous Psalms scroll shown here and the Isaiah scroll, both completely intact along with the book of Job. Portions of every book of the Old Testament were discovered with the exception of Esther. Once the scrolls were dated to between 200 BC and 68 AD, it became clear that what had been discovered were books of the Bible that were up to 1,000 years older than the oldest Hebrew manuscripts known previously. When compared with our modern translations, it was shown that the Bible we have today is virtually identical to extant copies that date back more than a millennia. Well, although criticisms about the authenticity of the modern biblical text were laid to rest by the comparative analysis with the Dead Sea Scrolls, other challenges have come from liberal scholars claiming that the Old Testament was written during the post-exilic period, after the exile of 580 BC, in order to create a nationalistic history and inspire the unity for those returning from Babylon. Well, this claim that the Bible was written during the post-exilic period was laid to rest in part by a discovery in 1979 of silver amulet scrolls, little bitty silver scrolls that you would wear around your neck is what these were. Well, the artifacts were found in a burial cave called Ketef Hinnon, which is in the Hinnon Valley, just outside the walls of Jerusalem, behind St. Andrew's Church. You can see St. Andrew's Church there to the right. The amulet scrolls were found by the archaeologist Gabriel Barkay, shown here, who uncovered some burial caves and an ancient Christian church with the help of a bunch of kids, 12 and 13-year-olds, kids from a local club. The caves were in bad condition, the burial caves. The roofs had collapsed, and they had been looted of all valuables with the exception of one little bead, all they found. Several seasons of excavation was one little bead. However, before leaving the site permanently, he decided to take some publicity photos. So he instructed a little boy to clean off a burial slab of the dust and dirt so he could take a publicity photo. Well, the boy got bored, as the story goes, and started banging around with his hammer and broke off a bottom of this burial slab. And as it turned out, it was not a burial slab at all, but was the top of a door frame of a yet undiscovered chamber. And in this undiscovered chamber, they found 125 objects of silver, 40 iron arrowheads, gold, ivory, glass, bone, and 150 semi-precious stones. The contents of the tomb were dated to be to the end of the 7th and the beginning of the 6th centuries BC, the time of Jeremiah the prophet, before the Babylonian exile. Well, due to their great age, shown here, experts were sought to unroll the scrolls to determine what was on them. So they first sent them to the University of Leeds in Britain, but they were refused. They refused to work on the scrolls for fear that they would destroy them in the process. So they were then sent to Germany, but were similarly refused. Technicians at the Israeli Museum in Jerusalem, the home of the Dead Sea Scrolls, decided to attempt the procedure themselves. For 3 years, the contents of the scrolls remained a secret. But in the end, both scrolls were found to contain the same biblical passage, what is known as the priestly blessing from Numbers 6, 24 and 26. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord makes his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. A customary prayer that pastors will say today over their congregation frequently before dismissing. Well, written in an ancient Hebrew script dated to the 7th century BC, the scrolls comprise the earliest known fragments of a biblical text and predate the earliest scrolls from the Dead Sea by more than 400 years. The earliest to writing date to the Dead Sea Scrolls to 400 BC. The amulet scrolls powerfully show the Old Testament being used in written form before, not after the Babylonian exile. And it also contains the oldest example that we have of the Tetragrammaton, the name of God. The YHWH is the oldest known example we have of God's name, the Tetragrammaton being used in a text. You know, we hear that, we see that in the text a lot, but many people don't know what the Jews call God. They have a name that they use for God. Most people don't know what that is, though. In normal circles, they don't call him Yahweh, Yahweh. They call him Hashem. You'll hear it in movies and things, but if you didn't know what they were talking about, it means the name. They call him the name, Hashem. Well, as with virtually all biblical events that include interactions with God or supernatural interventions, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is one that has been claimed fictitious, and thus archaeological verification of this event would be very supportive of biblical apologetics. The estimated dates from biblical scholars and archaeologists for the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah have varied a little bit. Ussher estimated that the destruction occurred in the year of 1897 BC. Thomas Robinson suggested a date of 1896 BC. Merle Unger gives a date of 2065. But most of your scholars seem to agree on the latest estimate for the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah as occurring in the year 2070 BC. That is if we assume a mid-15th century BC date for the Exodus. 2070 BC is the date they've cited on. In their textbook, A History of Ancient Israel and Judah, Miller and Hayes asserts that the story of the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah was copied from secular myths, a typical argument that you'll hear of biblical critics. They say this: the Sodom and Gomorrah story reflects yet another motif pattern known from extra-biblical literature, that of divine beings who visit a city to test the hospitality of its people and eventually destroy the inhospitable city. One can compare in this regard the Greek myth of Bacchus and Philemon. The presence of such traditional motifs in the biblical narrative raises the possibility that at least some of these narratives are purely products of the storyteller's art, which of course raises serious questions about their usefulness for historical reconstruction. Let's read a little bit of the text. From Genesis 13, we know why God destroyed the city. Now the men of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. Institutionalized pedophilia and the kind of things it's just terrible, terrible things. Genesis 19, the angels come to rescue Lot and his family. Do you have anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons or daughters, or anyone else in this city who belong to you? Get them out of here, because we're going to destroy this place. The outcry to the Lord against its people is so great that he has sent us to destroy it. And the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. Thus he overthrew those cities and the entire plain, including all those living in the cities and also the vegetation in the land. Well, Sodom and Gomorrah were 2 of 5 cities referred to in Scripture as the cities of the valley. Based on a number of biblical references, we can conclude that they were in the valley of the Dead Sea region, which you see here. The cities have been typically viewed as being in the valley in the southern end of the Dead Sea, where there's an expanse. However, many now place it on the northern end up here. So let's look at some biblical references to help with our geography, and then we'll see which of these locations seems to best fit the narrative. From Genesis 13, so Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him into the Negev. Now Abram was very rich in livestock and silver and gold, and he journeyed on from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. Well, Bethel and Ai are located about right there, best as I could place them for you. Let's continue. Genesis 13. And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zor. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. And I'll put an arrow there for you so you can see where east is from Bethel and Ai. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Well, this 1692 map of the ancient Holy Land by Philip Lee shows the destroyed cities of the valley lying under the current waters of the Dead Sea. This was a popular view until recently, a view that was refuted in part during the construction of the salt drying beds in the southern end of the Dead Sea, seen here from satellite photos during the construction from 1972 to 2011. During this massive construction project, no archaeological evidence of the cities were found, or no reports of them. Most people don't know what these are, that in the southern end of the Dead Sea, they're evaporating off the water to isolate the salt, and then they sell the salt. If you go on a tour to Israel and you stay at one of the hotels next to the Dead Sea, and you go out into the swimming areas where the salt is so buoyant you can't sink. But if you go to one of these hotels, it's not in the northern end of the Dead Sea, which has a normal salt concentration. It's down in that southern end, next to those salt drying beds where the salt concentration is actually much higher than it is up north. But it is, in fact, so salt, you can't sink. It creates a buoyancy that prevents you from sinking. And actually, they tell you not to sink, because if you try, you get a little bit of that salt water in your eyes, you're making your way to shore with, with crying until you get to shore and find some fresh water and stuff. I went out there, but I didn't get any salt in my eyes. But this map from Carl Spruner's 1865 map of the Holy Land shows Sodom and Gomorrah on the southern shore within the valley of Siddim, that's actually described during Genesis 14, during a war that takes place between the kings of Sodom and the other kings. They referred to the valley of Siddim in that one particular chapter. And you also see Zor identified on this map. It is one of the 5 mentioned cities of the valley. This map has it identified on the southeast. Personally, I do not think this region makes the best candidate for a land described as by Lot as like the garden of the Lord, given the salt deposits there today, but we can only speculate what it looked like back then. Today, there's massive salt deposits on the southern end, and actually tar pits are historically known in that area too, as well. It doesn't look like so green that it's like the garden of the Lord to me. Well, Zor is important for us in locating Sodom and Gomorrah, so we want to look at this. Because Zor was the city where Lot and his daughters fled to. They didn't want to go to the mountains. They wanted to go to a city. Here's the text. As morning dawned, and note that they were able to flee to Zor within the day, within just a few hours. As morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you will be swept away in the punishment of the city." But he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside the city. And as they brought them out, one said, "Escape for your life, but do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away." So we're going to continue. Note that Lot in this passage was able to travel to Zor within a day, which places it in close proximity to Sodom. And Lot said to them, "No, oh no, my lords, behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Behold, this city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one, and my life will be saved?" He said to him, "Behold, behold, I grant you this favor also, that I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Escape there quickly, for I can do nothing until you arrive there." Therefore, the name of the city was called Zor. So again, they were able to travel to Zor within a day, which places it in close proximity to Sodom. The sun had risen on the earth when Lot came to Zor. Then the Lord rained down on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heavens, and he overthrew those cities and all the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. But Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Okay, a little more geography to help us with our identification. Here again from Genesis 19. And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord. And he looked down towards Sodom and Gomorrah and towards all the land of the valley. And he looked, and behold, the smoke of that land went up like the smoke of a furnace. Well, the location where Abraham looked and saw the smoke rising was Hebron, shown on the map here, which doesn't really help us in favoring the northern versus the southern location, since it's about halfway in between. But it's still a worthy note for our geography. The text continues, describing that Lot subsequently fled to the mountains near Zor, where he and his daughters lived in the cave. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. Now Lot went up out of Zoar and lived in the hills with his 2 daughters, for he was afraid to live in Zoar, so he lived in a cave with his 2 daughters. So Lot fled to Zoar, but then after arriving in Zoar, decided he didn't want to stay in Zoar either, and they fled and lived in a cave near Zoar. Well, the most important source for locating Zoar and the cave where they lived is the Medaba map, as is known, shown here. This is a 6th century mosaic map on the floor of this Byzantine church located in Medaba, Jordan, depicting Palestine in the 6th century. Now, the church is located right here next to the Dead Sea, so you would assume the map on the floor of this church is a fairly credible piece of information. The map shown here details the region around Jerusalem, shown in the foreground, and the Dead Sea there in the background. On the southeast shore of the Dead Sea, the location of Zoar is shown, and the sanctuary, something called the Sanctuary of St. Lot, a church that was said to have been built in memory of Lot in front of the cave where he and his daughters lived after fleeing from Zoar. Well, the existence of the Sanctuary of St. Lot was discovered in 1983. Archaeological excavations between 1989 and 1993 identified both the Sanctuary of St. Lot, shown here, and a stone bearing the inscription St. Lot at this location. The church was built on the site of the cave traditionally held to be where Lot and his daughters had lived. In 2012, the Lot's Cave Museum, shown here, opened to the public. Well, Bryant Wood is the research director of the Associates for Biblical Research and has proposed a southern location for Sodom and Gomorrah, operating on the very reasonable assumption that the Sanctuary of St. Lot was built to preserve the actual location of the cave where Lot had lived. It's a reasonable assumption. So he has put forth several ancient town sites as being the biblical cities of the valley or plain mentioned in Genesis 19, with Ben-Hadrah and Numera identified as Sodom and Gomorrah. A linguistic connection can be argued to connect Numera with Gomorrah, since many times ancient names are preserved in modern Arabic place names, and the consonants in the names Gomorrah and in Numera are shared. So he argues for a linguistic connection of those 2 names in particular. Ben-Hadrah has been heavily explored by archaeologists and includes both a town site proper and cemeteries. You can see the town site pointed there and the cemeteries. There was occupational areas to the east, south, and west of the city walls as well. The main burial area that was used throughout more than 1,000 years that this town was occupied is estimated to contain somewhere close to 20,000 tombs, and would have held approximately 500,000 people at its heyday. Well, here is an enlarged view of Ben-Hadrah town site. Although the northern wall was lost due to erosion, it is estimated that the size of the fortified area was about 9 to 10 acres, typical of the fortified town sites in antiquity. Most seem to be about 9 to 10 acres. Here's remains of a city wall that was excavated. Here's another city wall, just to note through that little gap the proximity of the mountains in the background, possibly where the angels told Lot to flee to the mountains or you're going to be swept away. It's possible. Bryant Wood comments on the findings in the journal Bible and Spade. He says, following the destruction, there was occupation of Ben-Hadrah in the early Bronze Four period, but almost exclusively outside the destroyed fortified town. Following this brief period of extramural settlement, the site was permanently abandoned. Shown here are some excavation pictures from Numera as it appeared following the 1977 excavation season. It was occupied for less than a century, but the remains were better preserved at Numera than at Ben Hadrah. Textiles, string, rope, seeds, and even clusters of grapes survived amazingly well. Every room was filled with ash and burned debris. 2 victims are shown here, 2 victims that lost their lives in the destruction of Numera. They were found adjacent to the east tower, lying in ashy debris and buried under collapsed stones from one of the towers. Michael Coogan, one of the excavators, one of the archaeologists who excavated Numera, described what the archaeologists encountered. Under the topsoil and in naturally deposited wind-blown sandy soil, the entire area was covered by an ashy debris of the final destruction of the town, up to 0.4 meters in depth. This ash contained fragments of wooden beams that had supported the roofs of the dwellings and lay immediately over the latest occupational layer within each room, sealing the material beneath it. Not infrequently, there was mud brick debris over the ash, which had resulted from the collapse of the mud brick superstructure after the final conflagration. So there's evidence to support a southern location for Sodom and Gomorrah. But more recently, Steve Collins is another archaeologist, has put forth another site for the infamous Sodom and Gomorrah on the northern end of the Dead Sea, rather than the more traditional southern area. He's a professor at Trinity Southwest University and has a PhD in the biblical history and religion. Steve Collins, shown here. Steve Collins identifies this tell, called Tel El Hammam, as Sodom. Now, what tells are, a tell is basically a hill that someone suspected was not a natural hill, that may have been a city that over time just grew up into a hill. And they found that in many, so around Israel, around places of antiquity, they often find hills dotting the landscape, and when archaeologists go and do their digs, they realize it's not a natural hill, but it's a city that over centuries and centuries of occupation just grew up and up and up and up. Just like Seattle. Has anyone been to the underground Seattle tours? Seattle was destroyed and it's built right on top of it, and well, that's what they do. They're destroyed, you build right on top of it. You need your house, you lay a new foundation down and build up again. So over time, these cities would just get higher and higher and higher up, or they were built up for protection, walled in, but tells are hills that turned out to not be natural hills, but instead cities of occupational growth. So this is Tel El Hammam. Steve Collins identifies this as Sodom. This is located in a fertile area, you'll know from this picture, where there's still farming there today. Tel El Hammam is located about here, just north of the Dead Sea. Now, Genesis 13, which we read before, describes the region where Sodom was located as the Jordan Valley and calls them the cities of the valley, right? However, the Hebrew word translated as valley is the word kikar, which literally means circle or disc. This translation of the word, Collins argues, better describes the area to the north, shown here, which includes Jericho. Jericho's in that same general area. However, it should be noted that we don't know whether the southern end of the Dead Sea was filled full of water back in antiquity either. Could be that the southern end just wasn't full of water, and could as well be a location. But the location of the tell is identified here. There's an upper and lower tell of El Hammam are identified. This view is taken looking north from Mount Nebo, the place where Moses was granted a view of the Promised Land. Tel El Hammam, as shown from this diagram, was a major hub for commerce. We identify that by the trade routes to other cities from antiquity that are nearby. So it was a major center of a major trade route. Steve Collins provides this schematic to describe the history of development at Tel El Hammam and its occupation. So this shows the walls, towers, buildings found during the Middle Bronze 1 and 2 period. That's dated between like 1950 and 1540 BC. which then saw a sudden collapse around 1600 BC and was almost completely unoccupied during the late Bronze 2A period, 1350 BC, with then renewed occupation seen after or during the Iron Age 2 and 3 period, so 1000 to 332 BC. All right, just to give you a little look at the history of what happened there at that site. This graphic, also provided by Collins, shows the relative size of the occupation of Tel El Hammam, designated by color bar thickness and width over successive periods of time. Okay? Note that following the Middle Bronze Age, a dramatic collapse occurred at around 1600 BC, and little to no occupation was found in the late Bronze 2A period. Okay, however, remember that the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is put at about 2070 BC rather than 1600 BC. I mean, that's a pretty significant difference. I mean, that's almost 500 years difference. Now, is it possible that this is the location of Sodom? I mean, it's certainly possible that the assigned dates are just wrong. These are dates assigned by secular archaeologists. I mean, natural science is wrong about the age of the earth by about 4.6 billion years, so them being wrong about the date of the Bronze II period by 500 years doesn't seem that significant, but something is wrong with the assignment for sure. Well, other than the tradition of placing Sodom and Gomorrah in the southern valley of the Dead Sea, there are few problems with assigning Sodom to the northern end. And one of the most significant problems for assigning it to the southern end is the distance of Tel El Hammam to Zor. Okay, let me put these on the map for you there. So, remember that Lot traveled from Sodom to Zor between dawn and noon, according to biblical text. The distance from Zor to Ben Edrah, the site that Bryant Wood put forth, is about 16 miles, shown by the arrow there. But from Zor to Tel El Hammam, the northern location proposed by Steve Collins, is closer to 50 miles through difficult terrain, a distance much too far to traverse in a few hours. However, I'm not really sure there are good, credible reasons for assuming that the cave was occupied by Lot after fleeing Sodom. The cave sanctuary and the map found in Medaba date to about the same period, about the 6th century BC. Both of them were likely built around the same time period. When we consider the destruction of Sodom occurred in 2070 BC, you're talking about a difference of 2,600 years. It could very well be just a cave that was found by some locals. It started becoming traditionally known as Lot's Cave because it was right there next to the Dead Sea. And then after a few decades or even maybe a century of people calling it Lot's Cave, they decide that the tradition must be truth, and a local congregation decides to build a sanctuary over the cave. It could very well be just that simple. And in fact, many maps have Zor located on the northern end of the Dead Sea. I'll give you just a few examples here. You start looking around at maps of location of Sodom and Gomorrah, ancient maps for the location of Sodom and Gomorrah, and you will find Zor all over the place. I'm in northern end, southern end, here, western side of the Dead Sea, eastern side of the Dead Sea. So I'm not sure that we can count on Zor, to be honest. But there are several problems with assigning Sodom to this 1600 BC date. We could assign it to the northern end, but there's a problem with the 1600 BC date rather than 2070 BC, which is what our biblical scholars have identified the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah date to be. Distinguished professor of Old Testament studies at Dallas Theological Seminary and author of Kingdom Priest, A History of Old Testament Israel, shows in a recent Artifacts article that for Tel El Hammam to be Sodom, one must deny all the biblical dates before the time of the judges. He states this: However, both archaeological and biblical chronological data rule out Hammam as a candidate for patriarchal Sodom. After a great deal of analysis, Collins has concluded, based on stratigraphy, pottery assemblages, destruction layers, and architectural features, that the evidence points to the late Middle Bronze II period, 1600 BC, for the cataclysmic overthrow of this site, thus necessitating a date for the Abraham-Lot narrative at the same time. But it is precisely at this point that Hammam must, on biblical chronological grounds, be precluded from being a candidate as one of the cities of that narrative. And he gives these points for consideration. Number one, the chronological system of the Hebrew Masoretic text places the era of the patriarchal period between 2100 and 1700 BC. All subsequent biblical historical accounts no longer jive with each other or fit the periods of which a 1600 date assigns them. Besides the dismantling of the biblical chronological schemes and the rendering of their data as incorrect or meaningless, other numerical features, such as the time spans of the patriarchs, must also be discarded or radically reinterpreted. Most serious of all, though, he says, to the conservative scholar at least, is the methodological fallacy of testing and assessing biblical information in light of presumed archaeological primacy and the necessary shift of the grounds of authority from text to tell. He also adds this. He says, the only way out of the conundrum is if Hammam is for El Hammam to be Sodom is to, one, disregard the biblical figures for the age of the patriarchs completely. Two, jettison or greatly reduce the 250-year sojourn in Egypt. And three, minimize the length of the ministries of the judges and the reign of Saul nearly to the vanishing point. But he argues, he says, there's a methodological fallacy here that's being committed of shifting the ground of authority from text to tell. What he means is from the Bible to the archaeological ground. Something that I have to admit Stephen Collins is a bit guilty of. This is from his own website, from Collins' own website. He says this: on the one hand, it is intellectually dishonest to dismiss the Bible as a site selection parameter. There is no doubt that the Bible remains one of the best ancient geographical texts available to archaeologists and historians. And particular interest is generated in certain sites because of the potential biblical connections. This is reality. On the one hand, doing archaeology solely from a biblical perspective can mean missing the larger reality of Near Eastern culture milieu. A biblical hermeneutical bias might possibly influence the interpretation of data, which ironically could otherwise be used to illume the biblical narrative itself. I think if these archaeologists, whether they're biblical archaeologists or not, I think they're just a little too prone to accept these secular dates from carbon-14 dating or what have you. But how much good could they do the field of archaeology if they just trusted the biblical dates and used those to correct these secular dates to the Middle Bronze II period? If they accepted those biblical dates as truth, we'd make good progress in correcting our history there for sure. Well, one other question I often like to ask is this: why did Lot, a righteous man, choose to dwell among the Sodomites, who were so wicked and sinning greatly in this manner? I mean, think about it. Why did Lot live there? I mean, remember, he was arguably the only righteous man there. Remember this back and forth discussion, was that Abraham and God? What if there are 50 righteous people there? And okay, we won't destroy it if there's 45 people there. What if there's 40 and then 30 and then 20 and then 10? He haggles God all the way down to like 10 people and couldn't even find 10 people. It was just Lot, his wife and his daughters was all the people that escaped. They're the only righteous people in the entire city. Why did Lot live there? Well, I think we could ask the same question of ourselves. I mean, how far are we from seeing modern day Sodom and Gomorrah right where we are? And are we running to the hills to live in the hills in seclusion away from this moral depravity that we're finding ourselves surrounded by? I think you lived in Sodom for the same reasons we live where we live. Life is easy in a developed city. Think about going and living out in a cave in comparison to where you're living right now. How would you obtain food? How would you obtain water? How would you... I don't think we can judge Lot. I think he probably didn't want to make waves. There was a lot of sin going on. Probably didn't want to call out those sinners and make waves and cause himself some trouble. Well, let me highlight one last example. I want to give you one last piece of biblical archaeology. I want to highlight another important discovery that was only recently made in 1993. And this, again, in support of Old Testament history. The discovery was made at Tel Dan. Again, you know what a tell is now, right? It's a hill. That's not a natural hill. So Tel Dan, a tell, that was a location, one of the cities of the tribes of Dan. Now, the discovery that was made at Tel Dan, which is located about right here in the map, the far end of the kingdom of Israel. And Tel Dan is actually one of the source waters for the Jordan. There's like 3 separate source waters for the Jordan. Little bitty creek, like, I already call it a river, but anyway, Tel Dan, located about right there. There were a number of important discoveries were made at Tel Dan, arguably not the least of which was this structure. The oldest arched gate in the world, shown here. It's mud brick, arched gate, but 4,000 years old, dating to the 18th century BC. Agreed. Here's a model of that was at the site to help you better visualize what that mud brick gate looked like. These gates were massive structures. It wasn't just an entry door into a city. Entry into the city was gained by entering this gate area, which was for many cities. They got bigger as the cities got bigger, but multi-storied, and so let's give you an idea what the gate normally looked like. Another elaborate gate was discovered on the other side called the Israelite Gate due to an artifact that was found there. And this was also an elaborate gate featured an upper and lower area, each of those areas featuring inner and outer gates, plazas, and there was a judgment seat. Now, again, gates in antiquity were frequently elaborate in this way, multiple levels and departments of bureaucracy going on inside the gate. They were important locations where the kings where governance and trade took place, and the kings would sit for judgment. The judgment seat for the Israelite gate was right there behind me. If you couldn't tell that was me, that's a selfie. You gotta throw your selfies in there. Well, right there to my left was, I didn't know what it was. I had to come back and do some research on the site to come back. That's where the reconstructed judgment seat is. So I've zoomed in for you a little bit just to show you what that looks like. The 4 little pots that are sitting there next to it were apparently to hold poles, shade poles that you see there. A plaque there at the gate just to the right read this from 2 Samuel, and the king arose and sat in the gate, and all the people came before the king. Well, while excavating this stone Israelite gate between 1993 and 1994, a remarkable discovery was made, shown here. Now, most of the gate was constructed with typical building material of the area. However, 3 stone fragments were found that were unique and not made out of the same building material and contained ancient writing that was found to be Aramaic. The stone fragments were dated to the mid-800s of BC, and 13 lines of Aramaic text were partially preserved. Upon its translation, the fragment was determined to be part of a stone slab, what they call a stela, that commemorates the victory of an Aramean king over both Israelite and Judahite armies. The king of Aram boasts that he personally, under the divine guidance of the god Hadad, vanquished several thousand Israelite and Judahite horsemen and charioteers before personally dispatching both of his royal opponents. Although the names were not preserved on the fragments, most scholars believe that the stela recounts an actual historical event, a campaign of Hazael of Damascus in which he defeats both the Israelite and Judahite armies. Well, we know from 2 Kings 8:28 and 2 Chronicles 22:5 that Jehoram, king of Israel, and Ahaziah, king of Judah, were both defeated by Hazael. However, the most important aspect of the Tel Dan inscription is that it contains a reference to the house of David, which is the first historical evidence that we have of King David found outside the Bible, period. And perhaps more important, the stela set up by one of Israel's fiercest enemies more than a century after David's death were still referring to Israel as the kingdom of Judah, as the house of David. They were still referring to the kingdom of Judah as the house of David. I had something else I was like to try to add on, and I think I have enough minutes for this. Heinz may disagree here in just a second, but biblically, Dan, it's just an addendum. Okay, take this for what it's worth. Biblically, Dan is best known for its destructive influence on Israel, in leading them into idol worship. In 1340 BC, the Judges records the Danites stealing an idol from Micah and setting it up on a high place in the city of Dan. Jonathan, the grandson of Moses, founded a pagan priesthood with the Danites, which endured for hundreds of years. Judges 18 says, shown here on the screen, they called the name of the city Dan, after the name of Dan, their father, who was born in Israel. The sons of Dan set up for themselves the graven image, and Jonathan, the son of Gershon, the son of Manasseh, he and his sons were priests to the tribe of Danites until the day of the captivity of the land. So they set up for themselves Micah's graven image, which he had made all the time that the house of God was at Shiloh. Sorry for not pulling down the rest of the text. I didn't have a note there. Well, here's a video that I took when we were at Tel Dan. This is the excavations of the altar. The metal frame there that you see there is where the altar would have been located. Not an altar to sacrifice to God. All right? And then just to the right is the high place where they would have set up the idols. That's our tour group sitting over there on the steps, getting a nice lecture while I'm over here recording this video for you. So we're happy. I missed the lecture. Well, idolatry was that's the high place again where they would have set up that idol. Well, idolatry was a major problem for Israel, and the tribe of Dan features prominently in this sin. Here from 2 Kings, the sons of Israel did things secretly which were not right against the Lord their God. Moreover, they built for themselves high places in all their towns, from watchtower to fortified city. They set up for themselves sacred pillars and Asherim on every high hill and under every green tree, and there they burned incense on all the high places as the nations did, which the Lord had carried away to exile before them. And they did evil things, provoking the Lord. They served idols, concerning which the Lord said to them, "You shall not do these things." For 400 years after the Danites set up Micah's idol, King Jeroboam, set up a golden calf at Dan during his reign from 931 to 910 BC. The text says, when he had torn Israel from the house of David, they made Jeroboam the king of Nebat king the son of Nebat king. Then Jeroboam drove Israel away from following the Lord and made them commit a great sin. The sons of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam, which he did. They did not depart from them until the Lord removed Israel from his sight. And he spoke through all of his servants, the prophets. So Israel was carried away into exile from their own land to Assyria unto this day. What was the great sin? Well, Jeroboam corrupted the worship of Jehovah by setting up golden calf idols in both Dan and Bethel, and changed the place of worship from Jerusalem to these cities under the guise of convenience. Jeroboam also appointed priests from among the tribes other than the Levi, and all to the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, from the 7th month, 15th day, to the 8th month, 15th day. God also detested Israel's idol worship. He so detested Israel's idol worship that he destroyed them, allowing them to be conquered and hauled off into captivity by the Assyrians in 723 BC. The tribe of Dan was such a destructive influence in leading all Israel into idol worship that arguably it is the reason why they're not listed with the other tribes of Israel in Revelation. They're the only tribe of the 12 that are not mentioned in Revelation for the sin of idolatry. We should, however, not be too judgmental about idolatry of Israel. It has been one of Satan's main strategies and one of the church's biggest problems. He wants us to prioritize or elevate anything above God in our lives. Today, the Pope is regarded as the head of the Catholic Church, not Christ. The apostles and saints are honored by naming churches after them instead of Christ. If you go into these beautiful, beautiful cathedrals and basilicas, you'll find people venerated everywhere. This is the Basilica of St. John in Rome. We went there when I was on one of my trips to Israel and Rome. Massive, 20-foot high sculptures of the 12 apostles are along the walls. There's a sculpture, a statue of Jesus on the roof, but he's completely overshadowed. Completely overshadowed. Well, idolatry happens through syncretism. Syncretism happens, and this has been one of the church's biggest problems since the beginning. See, syncretism happens when we assimilate traditions into our culture, including into our religious practices. The Israelites wanted a king because other nations had them, so they got one, rejecting God in the process. God commanded the Israelites to remain separate or holy, or they would fall into idolatry, which they did. They worshiped the Baals, the Asherah, because it was popular to do so. They even sacrificed their children by fire. Well, the modern church, our church, also badly engages in syncretism in both our holy day celebrations and religious services. Christmas is all but unrecognizable today as a Christian holiday. We have assimilated so many pagan customs, and it has become all about receiving gifts. By inserting a fictitious Santa Claus as a source of gifts that we receive, we're not even able to reciprocate and give a gift in exchange. It's become all about receiving gifts, which encourages covetousness. We know this to be true from our time as kids during Christmas. Christmas for us is all about getting gifts, right? We know this is true. Christ in the celebration is completely overshadowed by these customs. Syncretism, the assimilation of traditions or practices of others, occurs due to covetousness, which Paul defines as idolatry. We covet, idolize what people have and what they do, and we start doing these things ourselves. It's probably not a matter of if there is idolatry in our lives, but simply what form it takes. What are you placing in your life above God? What would you rather do on Sunday rather than go to church? Do you stay home and watch the Seahawks when there's a game on Sunday? or go to whatever the stadium is called today? I can't even tell. Or do you go snowboarding on Sunday because the crowds are smaller? Guilty. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we can trust the Bible. Although archaeologists and other secular scientists may claim parts of the Bible are untrue, when the scientific findings are evaluated and interpreted correctly, we will always find that science supports the biblical history. Do not be led away by false teachers. Paul warned us in 2 Timothy, "For the time will come when men will not put up with sound doctrines. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. They will turn their ears away from the truths and turn aside to myths." Ladies and gentlemen, that's what natural history is. That's what natural science is. People have turned away from the truth and have turned aside to myths. The myth that this world came about somehow all by itself, they're purely natural processes. And a worse myth yet, that we're nothing but a bunch of evolved apes, a bunch of evolved animals. Let me close out in a word of prayer. Father God, we thank you so much, Lord, for your word. Your word that has given us so much insight, that helps us understand not just the history of this world, but helps us understand you, Lord God, your will for us, your purpose and your plan for us, Lord God. Father, today we ask for wisdom. Father God, give us wisdom, Lord. Help us to understand your word. The centuries and centuries and centuries of cultural traditions and idioms, Father. Help us to understand your word, Father, so that we may be better witnesses for you. Help us to better understand the science that's being used today to attack your word and convince others that it is untrue. Father God, help us, Lord, to be a witness for you with wisdom, Father, and with boldness. Help us, Lord, to be a witness for you, Father, to be bold to recognize that we are in possession of a great truth and that everyone around us is lost, not knowing where they are and not knowing who they are. Help us to be bold with the truth that we have, Lord God. Praise you, Father. Thank you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Chris. Give me a hand for that. So we'll take a few minutes for questions. I'm sure there's questions people want to ask about some of the topics he covered or something related to archaeology or history or the Bible. So if you raise your hand, I'll bring the microphone around so people can hear the question as well as the answer. One question I have for you, Chris, was you know about the Ebla tablets that were found in northern Syria. I don't know if you've studied them at all, but they mention all 5 cities of the plains, and they were written, more than 1,000 years before the time of Moses. So the fact that people question, did Sodom and Gomorrah even exist? They're mentioned in the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, many times, but they're also mentioned in these ancient tablets. A very important find.
Oh, I need a reference on that. Send that to me.
Yeah. There are 5,000 towns and cities are mentioned there, and many of them are in the Bible as well. Other questions, comments people have? I know there's a lot of information given out here.
Heinz, I couldn't remember if I had done the talk that was on Egypt here.
No.
If so, that would be a good one maybe to do next year or the year after that.
Yeah.
The second part of this goes in the Egyptian synchrony.
Yeah.
Is there any evidence for Joseph? Who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? And if you look at the right place, it's all there. They claim there's no evidence for vast Israelite slaves in Egypt, all this kind of stuff. You just got to look at the right time. It's all there. So.
Yeah, I forgot to mention up front that Chris has done 2 different lectures on archaeology and history related to the Bible, and the second one we'll have him give next year sometime. So we appreciate the research he's done. There's others that have done research as well. Patrick Nuri has been here, and he's done some study of Egyptian history as well, but not as deep as Chris is going to get into next time. So raise your hand if you,
I didn't mention my lecture notes if you didn't get a chance to get those. QR code, most people seem to know what to do with that now, but.
Thank you very much. That was a lot of information there. thing that kind of stuck out to me and just had a question was the sulfur. And, you know, one would think maybe that had some volcanic, you know, contribution or something like that. But has there been any investigation or any sulfur residue of any type located in Sodom and Gomorrah?
I mean, there has. Probably some of the best work that's been done up at this point has been by Steve Austin, one of the scientists with the Institute for Creation Research, a geologist by the name of Steve Austin, has done some pretty good work on trying to come up with a geologic explanation for the event. You know, it's one of these slip strike fault zones. It's on the lowest elevations on Earth. So he attributes, you know, he gives some good explanations for a geological source for it. But I'm a little reluctant to do such things. You know, I mean, maybe we can find some natural process that was involved with how the flood, how did the flood, was the flood caused, or how was Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed? I don't know. Whether it was geologic or whether it was God rained down from heaven. I don't think we will know on this one how God destroyed those cities. But
yes, you mentioned Katif Hinnom.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that was where the silver amulet scrolls were discovered. Now, and it was also an area that was related to the time of Jeremiah, I believe you said.
I'm correct. So it was argued that the Bible had been written during the post-exilic period. These amulet scrolls were from before the exilic, were written before the exilic period, during the time of Jeremiah the prophet.
Okay, so would this Katif Hinnom area be related to the Valley of Hinnom by Jerusalem, where the sons and daughters were burned?
No, it's not the Hinnom Valley, right?
Yes, right by the city of Jerusalem, where they burned. It was like a burial ground, and they burned the sons and the daughters. So that's where their dump was. That's where the dump was. There was just kind of a constant fire going there where they would dump that. That's very possible that is in that same valley area. Especially if it's related to Jeremiah, who talked about that a lot.
Interesting. I mean, it has to be. It's right outside Jerusalem. But of course, almost any place you dig around Jerusalem, you're going to find tombs at this point. It's a city that's been occupied for so long, you can't hardly put a spade in the ground without finding a burial site at some point.
Other questions people have? Chris will be around, of course, afterwards as well. You can ask him some more questions.
And like I said, you can download the lecture notes there. If it'll download a PDF version for you.
Okay, well, if there's no more questions right now, let's give him a hand for the presentation. And I just have a few comments in closing. Just the next slide there, Ron Payne, who's one of our board members, he's spoken here before, and he does the tours. But next month, he's going to speak on this topic of thinking through the miracles of Christ. And some of the points that he wants to cover there are listed under that title. He's got 6 different points. You can read that there. Ron is retired from the industry. He's been working on creation and apologetics for the last 15 years or so. He was a board member of CAPS, an earlier organization in Bellevue on creations, and also the Mount St. Helens Museum there. He was a board member there, and he's now a board member here for us. So he'll have an interesting presentation. He's just working on that and has done it all from scratch, and I think you'll enjoy it. So just to remind you that there are refreshments in the kitchen area there, and of course there are resources, books, and DVDs. We have a lot of different stuff from all the major creation organizations, ICR, CMI, and AEIG. But we also have things from other creation and apologetics organizations available there. So there'll be people at the tables there that can help you with that. Remind you, if you're not on our mailing list, there's a sign-up sheet on the back table. Take advantage of that. Put your name and email on there. You'll be informed of all upcoming meetings. And there's flyers on different events coming up. If you're interested in a creation tour, look at this one here in the back table. It's got Ron's phone number. And there's a flyer on Ron's talk. And, of course, all this is on our website, apologeticsforum.org. And then last but not least is this new apologetics conference that Mike Riddle is putting on. And if you look at the topics there, you'll find it very interesting. It addresses all the major cultural issues of the day. It's going to cover all that in one day. So they're all listed there. Just go to our website, click on A21C, and you get all the information, and you can also register there according to the instructions. And remind you that if you want to be part of supporting this ministry, there are donation boxes on the back seats there, and you can write a check to Apologetics Forum, or just cash is fine as well. And also, if you want to make donations online, you can do that as well. So let me just close up in a word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed. Father, we thank you for this session here. We thank you for Chris and his ministry and his family there, all involved in that. And pray for all the efforts he has done, the teaching he has done at the Christian schools there, and all the presentation that he has been working on over the years. And we appreciate the information that he has given to us. It impresses upon us that you have left much evidence for the truth of your word.